Hi, students. This week we are talking about death and loss. Now, I know that for many, you may have seen this chapter title and you may have been like, oh my gosh, I really don't want to talk about death and loss. And I understand that because I get that we have fears about death, right? We fear this idea that we're going to like cease to be, okay, or uh leaving behind our loved ones, or encountering the unknown and coping with the difficulties that are involved in potentially a like painful, long drawn out dying process, and potentially like the growing distance in the memories of others due to like loss and death, and over time uh, we may start to lose our memories of others. And so we have a lot of fears that surround the idea of death, but I think there are benefits to facing death, to searching for the meaning of death, which may actually help us to find the meaning of life. And the reality is that life and death are two facets of the same reality that we live in, right? And sometimes when we look at the aspect of death and we come to the realization like death will happen, it helps to potentially revitalize our goals and get us like geared up and ready to go. Things like we could start to gain this acceptance of death that can lead to the discovery of meaning and purpose in our life. Okay, because the reality is our time on earth is limited. And if we want to do something in our life, we only have a certain amount of time to do this. Okay. And I'll tell you a story. So I was at a weekend workshop, and the individual who was facilitating this, um, there was about 15 of us. Okay. And so on one of the days, to start off the day, he has us sit down and write three things. Okay. So one is, how do we see our purpose in life? Like what is our ultimate goal in life? And then two, what is our greatest fear? Okay, when it comes to like life, it's not talking about like spiders. It's talking about like an existential fear that we may have. And three, he asked us to write down some loved ones. And then he told us, fold that up, put it in your pocket. And then we went on with the day. And I totally forgot that that paper was even in my pocket. So later that night, he takes all of us and leads us out to like the beach, and then blindfolded, he leads us out there. We were very close to the beach, and he gives each of us a shovel, and he tells us, dig a hole that's about your like body size, and maybe about 2 feet deep. Okay. I was like, oh, this is weird. So I start like digging this hole, and I'm looking at the guy who, is maybe like 3 or 4 feet from me, and I'm digging this hole thinking, what is this? And I'm trying to figure it out because that's what I like to do. I like to try to figure these things out. And it dawns on me like, he's having us dig our grave, right? He's having us dig a hole that resembles the idea of a potential grave. And so I'm digging, digging, digging. And one of the guys misunderstood the directions and just dug straight down. And so he had this big, deep hole about his size, but about 2 feet wide. So, anyways, so as we're finishing digging our little hole, he tells us, all right, now get inside it. So we get inside it and we're like laying there, and we can't see each other now. But the facilitator, he comes around to like my shoulder, and he bends down on one knee and he says, do you still have that piece of paper in your pocket? And I was like, oh yeah. And I pull it out and give it to him. And he opens it up and he says, you died today. and you were never able to fulfill. And then he like read off my life purpose. And he said, and what held you back was, and then he read off my fear. And then he said, and these loved ones, and he read off the loved ones on my sheet of paper, came to your funeral and they talked about how great of a man you were, but you didn't fulfill your life's purpose. And all the while he's saying this to me, I got another guy down like by my feet who's like starting to bury me, starting to give that like 4D effect, right? Where he's like throwing sand on me while the facilitator is saying these things to me. Then he hands me back the piece of paper and he says, sit with that, and he leaves. And so that experience really spearheaded my goal to become a professor. Okay. I was early in my career at that time, and it really pushed me to say, all right, I got to clear out all the other clutter. I got to focus on what I want to do. Okay. And my goal has always been to change like tens to hundreds of lives, who can then change thousands of lives, who can then change hundreds of thousands of lives. And so it's like this domino effect. That was always my goal. And here I am. So, that experience allowed me to face my death, and face my reality, and helped me to realize how short my time on earth really is. And it put so many things in perspective for me. Like I started thinking about even just school. Like, yeah, I spent 7 years in school, but what's 7 years in the grand scheme of my life? Like 7 years is just a small part of it, right? I'm going to work my job for potentially 30 years. 30 years of working one job, right? Like going to school for 7 years, 8 years, maybe even like 9 or 10 years. It doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal when I look at the grand scheme of things. Okay, that's what this experience helped me put into perspective. I'm not saying go out there and do this, but the reality is that when we face the meaning of death, it can actually have some benefits for us. Okay. And so when we are faced with like death or loss in our life, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross actually talks about the stages that we go through. And this is a common theme that we always talk about when in psychology, when we talk about death. Okay. And so Kubler-Ross actually talked about how we go through the stages of denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. And so the initial belief of Dr. Kubler-Ross is that we go through each stage. So we start at one stage, we go to the next stage, go to the next one, go to the next one, and then end up in acceptance. Now, what research has really shown us is that we are way too complex of beings to just go through these stages. So we actually often jump around, and we may start in one stage, end in another stage. A year later, let's say like on the anniversary of a loved one's passing, it may start up again. We may actually experience these stages again. Okay. And Kubler-Ross believed that acceptance needed to be the end goal, but sometimes people have a challenging time moving into acceptance, or they're not ready to move into acceptance, or they move into acceptance, something happens later, and they come out of acceptance and end up in like anger or depression. Okay. And so denial is this idea of like denying that, especially with like loss, that's maybe someone is gone. Okay. Or denying that one was given a terminal illness, like diagnosis of a terminal illness. Getting angry with oneself or the people around them. All right, starting to bargain with like the God as they see it, or with themselves, or with their family, or with the doctors, like bargaining. I'll give you all kinds of money. I'll give you all the money I have if you just give me the cure. Depression, okay, and then acceptance, where the individual has accepted that the individual has passed, or has accepted that this illness, this terminal illness, is like going to take their life. Okay. And I talked about Randy Pausch in the reflection discussion for this week. And in that book, he kind of talks about these stages and what he went through and how he jumped around. Okay. And in the end, he did end up in acceptance, and which is why he also finished writing the book, got it published, all this other stuff. Okay. So those are the stages of death and loss. But there are other models to this idea of like death and one's grieving. Okay. We also have like the relational model of death and grieving, that believes that people are born into networks of relationships, and we remain like woven into these networks even after our death. Okay. Those who lose a loved one can actually find comfort in developing a new relationship with the deceased, right? Changing their relationship and developing a new relationship and still keeping that connection. One can do this through remembering the individual, okay, like having a day of remembrance, a time of remembrance. Many cultures actually have this, like a day of remembrance for their loved ones who have passed, right? And it helps to foster the memory of the person's life, and it helps to keep those conversations about their loved ones, okay? Because that's the goal. The goal is to maintain an ongoing relationship rather than detaching and just like moving on. And this can be very helpful for some people. Not everybody is going to do this, but it can be helpful. And so that's the relational model of death and grieving, right? But often individuals want to grieve and then move forward. Okay. And when we are trying to grieve, individuals may go through like grief work or bereavement work, where they explore their feelings that have been created due to this significant loss. These like grief groups can be within like churches. You can find them in hospitals, community centers, and they can all be very, very helpful for an individual to really kind of grieve, but also process what they've experienced. Actually think about like that movie with Will Smith, Collateral Beauty, right? It's a very touching movie, and it's a movie about like grief and moving through, right? So the only way through is like the only way to the end is through. Okay. That's kind of like a common idea of grief, is you can only move through it. You can't avoid it. You can't go around it. You can only move through it. Now, the book talks about what they call like the 10 touchstones when it comes to grief. And so they talk about things like being open to the presence, or opening to the presence of loss, the dispelling of misconceptions about grief, embracing the uniqueness of grief, exploring the feelings of loss, recognizing one is not crazy and they are experiencing grief, gaining a better understanding of the needs of mourning, nurturing oneself, reaching out to others, seeking reconciliation, right? And coming to appreciate one's process of transformation. They call these the 10 touchstones, because these are the 10 things that many individuals need to learn, focus on, and like actively do in order to pass through or move through their experience of grief. And then the book also talks about 4 tasks of mourning: accepting the reality of the loss, working through the pain and grief, adjusting to an environment in which the deceased is missing, and then emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life. So this is what some individuals may want to do when they are experiencing this mourning, bereavement, or grief. They may want to actually move through these four tasks so they will then move on with life. And if you've ever lost somebody, you can understand like the challenges that many of us face when it comes to experiencing loss and death. Okay. Um, and this, like the aspects of rituals when it comes to loss and death have been around for a very long time, right? Archaeology, anthropology, we have seen that humans for a very long time, and even I believe Neanderthals have some history of this as well, have had rituals surrounding death. Okay, so we understand that the experience of loss and the experience of losing someone um, is a human experience for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It hasn't gotten any easier, right? So, but one thing, and part of the reflection discussion question is what makes you feel alive, right? What brings life to yourself? Okay. Is it falling in love? Is it accomplishing something big? Is it uh, being with friends, being with family, right? Having a good time, laughing, experiencing those relationships with each other. Or maybe it's a sensation seeking behavior like riding roller coasters, right? But think about what makes you feel alive. And then think about, and this is also part of that discussion, is what in life tends to like blunt that feeling of alive? Like, how come we can't feel that all the time? Right. And so we can't because of responsibilities, because, we have other things going on in life, or sometimes even the idea that we are facing grief, we're facing bereavement, and it's hard to feel alive in that experience. Okay. So just some food for thought about death and loss and this idea of like looking to the meaning of life or looking to the meaning of death and finding a meaning of life.